number 10 is North Korea camp. North Korean prison camps are a place of horror. Now this photo was taken at one of their camps called Chonggori Camp. The main purpose of Chonggori Camp is to punish people for usual crimes or political crimes such as illegal border crossings. Now the prisoners here are also used as slave laborers, and as a result they are forced to do hard and dangerous work for 14 hours a day. The prisoners live in crowded, dirty, insect-infested rooms without heating, while there is just one washing room for 1,000 prisoners. Now because of these bad hygienic conditions, in the summer of 2003, about 190 prisoners died of an infectious disease. Now 70 prisoners sleep in a room which is only designed to hold 20 people, lying on the floor without pillows or blankets. Not to mention, prisoners only get 140 grams of rice 3 times a day, while they're being forced to do hard labor such as logging with iron chains. Now often prisoners have their lives ended or they are crippled in work accidents. Prisoners are regularly subjected to beatings and inhumane treatment, all of which are administered by the guard's discretion. When a prisoner breaks a rule, he is tormented and confined in a solitary cell so small where he cannot stretch his legs for many days or weeks. Now many people say these camps have human rights violations, and with everything we do know, I can't imagine all the other horrors of the other camps. Number 9. Dorothy Counts. Dorothy Counts is an American civil rights pioneer and one of the first black students admitted to the Harry Harding High School. In 1956, 40 black students from North Carolina applied to transfer to a white school after the passing of the Purcell Plan. Dorothy's family applied her and her 2 brothers to enroll in an all-white school after her father was approached by Kelly Alexander Sr. Now of her family, only Dorothy was accepted, and Dorothy was dropped off on her first day of school by her father, along with their family friend, Edwin Tompkins. As their car was blocked from going closer to the entrance, Edwin offered to escort Dorothy to the front of the school while her father parked the car. As she got out of the car to head down the hill, her father told her, "Hold your head high, you are inferior to no one." Now in this photo, you can see her being harassed by her classmates. After just 4 days of harassment that threatened her safety, her parents withdrew her from the school, but the images of Dorothy being verbally assaulted by her white classmates were seen around the world. Number 8. First woman in the Boston Marathon. Kathrine Switzer was 20 years old when she decided to run the Boston Marathon in 1967. Now at the time it was an all-male race. Women were not allowed to run and organizers always ridiculed them. Now no one believed a woman could run it, so when Kathrine signed up, she signed the necessary paperwork with her initials. When the race started, she set off alongside her boyfriend Tom Miller, and while running, camera crews and photographers from a press bus spotted her and photographed her a lot. Now as this was happening, an official spotted her running. Jock Semple, the race manager, ran after her in leather shoes and tried to rip off her number. "Get the hell out of my race and give me those numbers," he yelled. Now before he could pull her out of the race, Tom blocked him. The idea of women running in the marathon was highly controversial. Now Kathrine finished the race knowing it would look like a publicity stunt if she stopped, and thankfully 5 years later, women were given the right to run in the marathon. Number 7. Last public execution. Eugen Weidmann was a German criminal and serial slayer who was executed by guillotine in France in June 1939, which was the last public execution in France. After a failed first attempt, Eugen and his accomplices managed to successfully kidnap an American woman named Jean de Coven, and Jean was lured to the house the trio rented, and she was strangled to death by Eugen and buried in the backyard. A couple months later, Eugen shot a chauffeur named Joseph Chofi to death and stole his money. Just 2 days later, Eugen ended the life of a woman named Janine Keller. Janine was also shot and robbed. 3 other people had their lives ended by Eugen and his accomplices, all of them being shot to death and then robbed. Eugen's last victim had a business card from Eugen in his house, which resulted in the police tracking down Eugen, since it seemed that he was one of the last people who had seen the victim alive. When confronted, Eugen tried to shoot the 2 policemen who had come to arrest him. However, Eugen was knocked unconscious unconscious with a hammer by one of the policemen and promptly taken into custody. He was found guilty of homicide and was sentenced to death. On June 17, 1939, Eugen was beheaded outside the prison in Saint Pierre in Versailles. The historical behavior by spectators was so scandalous that French President Albert Lebrun immediately banned all future public executions. Number 6. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. The Dyatlov Pass Incident was an event in which 9 Soviet hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains between February 1st and 2nd, 1959, under uncertain circumstances. This creepy photo shows the determined group traversing in the harsh terrain just before they met their fate on the night of February 1st. Now, what happened? The experienced trekking group from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, led by Igor Dyatlov, had established a camp in the Russian SFSR of the Soviet Union. Now, overnight, something caused them to cut their way out of their tent and flee the campsite while inadequately dressed for the heavy snowfall and sub-zero temperatures. After the group's bodies were discovered, an investigation by Soviet authorities determined that 6 of them had died from hypothermia, while the other 3 had died by physical trauma. One victim had major skull damage, 2 had severe chest trauma, and another had a small crack in his skull. 4 of the bodies were found laying in running water in a creek, and 3 of those 4 had damaged soft tissue of the head and face, and 2 of the bodies had missing eyes, 1 had a missing tongue, and 1 had missing eyebrows. No one's really too sure what happened to them and why it happened either, but it's just strange. Number 5. Shell-shocked soldier. Before shell shock was called war neurosis or post-traumatic stress disorder, and before experts actually began to understand the psychological trauma that the war could cause, veterans of World War I were largely left to fight their own mental health battles. Now, shell shock is a word that originated during World War I to describe the type of post-traumatic stress disorder that many soldiers experienced during the war. It is a reaction to the intensity of the bombardment and fighting that produced a helplessness which could manifest as panic, fear, flight, or an inability to reason, sleep, talk, or walk. During the war, the concept of shell shock was poorly defined, and cases of shell shock could be interpreted as either physical or psychological injury. Now, the creepy historical image of the shell-shocked soldier seen here starkly highlights the horror of the war and what being stuck in the trenches during the Battle of Flers-Courset could do to a man. Captured in September 1916, this photo was taken years before World War I even ended. By the time the end came, countless other men would suffer a similar fate. Number 4. The Frozen Man of Mount Everest. In May 1996, mountain climber Beck Weathers and his team attempted to complete their ascent of Mount Everest. Although they only had a small stretch to go, Beck came down with a bad case of snow blindness, and after getting stuck in a harrowing blizzard with a wind chill of 100 degrees below zero, he fell into a hypothermic coma. Frostbite set on his nose and hands, both of which were later amputated. Miraculously, he managed to survive, walked back to camp, and was airlifted for treatment. Initially, I thought I was in a dream, Beck later recalled. Then I saw how badly frozen my right hand was, and that helped bring me around to reality. Now, for those of you who don't know, climbing Mount Everest is extremely dangerous, and it's a miracle that he's alive. Number 3. The Human Dolls. Anatoly Moskvin is a Russian former journalist, college professor, and self-dubbed necropolist with expert knowledge of cemeteries. Now, this man was a little strange as he loved collecting dolls. He had many, and the figures he had resembled antique dolls. They wore fine and varied clothing, some wore knee-high boots, and others had makeup over their faces Anatoly had covered in fabric. He had also hidden their hands in fabric, except these dolls were not dolls, they were mummified corpses of human girls. Yeah, you heard that right. He was obsessed with digging up the dead and making dolls out of their corpses. After making his human dolls, he kept them in his home as his companions and lovers. I kissed her once, then again, Anatoly wrote about one of his dolls, made from the body of a young girl. Police finally caught him in 2011 after years of increasing suspicion at the growing number of discarded graves in his home city. When the police searched his home, they found 26 life-size dolls, or rather mummified corpses, scattered throughout. When police moved one of the bodies, it played music as if on cue, as inside the chests of many of the dolls, Anatoly had embedded music boxes. There were also photographs and plaques taken off the gravestones, doll-making manuals, and maps of local cemeteries strewn about the apartment. Police even discovered that the clothes worn by the mummified corpses were the clothes in which they were buried. Now, this is just overall disturbing. I just can't. Number 2. Michael Rockefeller. Michael Rockefeller, the son of New York Governor and soon-to-be U.S. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, disappeared somewhere in Papua New Guinea in the early 1960s. Seen here smiling on his first trip there in May 1960, you wouldn't be aware of his fate. In November 1961, he traveled to the jungles of New Guinea to spend time with the native Asmat tribes when he went missing. Despite a 2-week search and a witness who supposedly saw him swimming in the ocean, his body was never found. A theory of what happened is that he was eaten by people, as the Asmat tribes were involved in that practice and sometimes ended people's lives as a part of rituals. It's also been said that his boat overturned near the Asmat region of the island. The boy swam to the shore to look for help, and that's it. No one ever saw him again. But at least some members of the local tribes have told stories indicating that Michael's life was ended upon reaching the shore, and his body was cut up and the parts were handed out as gruesome trophies. Regardless of what happened, it's just a sad situation overall. And coming in at number 1 is human zoo. You think animal zoos are bad? Just wait until you hear about us humans putting other humans in a zoo. Human zoos were public displays of people, usually in so-called natural or primitive states. They were most prominent during the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 1870s, exhibitions of so-called exotic populations became popular throughout the Western world. Human zoos could be seen in many of Europe's largest cities, such as Paris, Hamburg, London, Milan, as well as American cities such as New York City and Chicago. Now, these photos were taken in 1904, where the US government imported 1,300 indigenous Filipinos from different tribes to display at the St. Louis Exposition in 1904. There's also one girl known as the Filipino Zoo Girl, and she was displayed at the Coney Island Zoo in 1904. She was a zoo attraction among the monkeys and lizards to show off the new US possessions in the Philippines. She was bound by ropes and visitors threw her peanuts, and it was just overall disgusting how they were treated.
To start off the list with this image here. This is not one of those niche taxidermy pieces. This is indeed a living two-headed dog, pieced together by a mad scientist. Vladimir Demikov was a scientist from the Soviet Union who did some really questionable stuff back in the 50s. He came up with this strange idea of attaching the head of one dog onto another, creating a two-headed dog. Now, why? Well, he wanted to figure out more about organ transplants and see how the body would react to these surgeries. From a pure scientific perspective, what he did was kind of a big deal. It was about pushing the limits of what doctors could do back then. But is it incredibly creepy and unethical? Absolutely. This sparked a huge ethical debate. Seemed like some bizarre freak show rather than an ethical scientific pursuit, and people got pretty upset about it. Playing around with life like that, creating these weird creatures just for the sake of curiosity, it didn't sit well with a lot of folks, and unsurprisingly, the dogs didn't live very long after these experiments. So while Demikov's work was kind of groundbreaking, it was also just downright cruel. You know what's downright cruel to us is if you don't subscribe to this channel. I mean, what are you waiting for? It's free. We got awesome videos coming your way on the daily, so don't miss out. Hit that button down below. Next up, we have this image here of Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his team of explorers after finally reaching the South Pole. It had been a long, grueling, treacherous expedition, and they'd arrived only to find out that a Norwegian team of explorers had beaten them to the punch. Not only were these men now exhausted, starving, and frostbitten, but they wouldn't even be remembered as the team to reach the South Pole first, and now they had to make the long return trip back to base camp. You can see how miserable and distraught they all look here, not to mention very unwell. Definitely frostbitten. Tragically, the team would never make it home alive. The weather was harsh, they were already suffering from exhaustion, and they were running out of supplies. The first member of the team to pass was Edgar Evans, who died on February 17th of 1912. Then Lawrence Oates willingly walked out into a blizzard, ending his own life. Scott, along with Edward Wilson, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans, kept going, but things got worse. A storm ended up trapping them in their tent for 9 whole days, and they couldn't move. They died in the tent, just 11 miles away from where they could get more supplies. This is a photograph taken in 1986 of what were known as the Chernobyl liquidators. See those white stripes, the patterns at the bottom of this photo? That was caused by radiation on the film. The Chernobyl liquidators were a group of people who were called in to clean up the mess after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. Their job was to try and make things safer for dealing with the radioactive contamination. These were regular folks, soldiers, firefighters, and other workers who faced really dangerous conditions to help control the aftermath. These workers had to deal with high levels of radiation, and many of them got sick later on due to exposure. They didn't have fancy gear like we might see today. In fact, there wasn't even enough protective equipment for everyone, so some of them had to construct their own out of leather and lead plates. It was an incredibly tough and risky job, and they faced severe health consequences because of it. Some, of course, even died because of the exposure.
Number 6. Erase Nikolai Yezhkov. Nikolai Yezhkov was a Soviet secret police officer under Joseph Stalin who was the head of the NKVD from 1936 to 1938 during the height of the Great Purge. He organized mass arrests, torment, and executions, but then he fell from Stalin's good graces. He was arrested and subsequently admitted in a confession to a range of anti-Soviet activity, including unfound arrests during the Purge. He was executed in 1940 along with others who were blamed for the Purge, and Nikolai was not only ousted, executed, and disgraced along with his family, he was then methodically erased from photographs where he had previously appeared with his commander. Overnight, Nikolai went from one of the highest officers in a powerful New World Order to a shadow in a poorly lit photo and a name no one dared to utter. Now, Nikolai wasn't the only person to receive this Photoshop treatment, as it was common in the communist government to deny failures and make inconvenient truths even people disappear. Now, this practice has continued in current communist-led governments where rebellious leaders are removed by force and deleted from official documents. Number 5. Criminals in a Box. This disturbing photo was taken in July 1913 by French photographer Albert Kahn. He often took trips through exotic countries, and it was during a visit in Mongolia that he happened to stumble upon this woman who had been condemned to a slow and painful starvation. She was boxed up in what would become her tomb and deposited in a remote desert. There were bowls of water on the ground, and the prisoner is allowed to beg passerbys for food, though not much is given. Now, the photographer was forced to leave her there, as it would be against prime directive of anthropologists to intervene in a culture's law or order system. Anthropologists are only able to observe, they cannot push their own beliefs or interfere in any way. Now, it's just incredibly disturbing though, and I can't imagine what was going through Albert's mind when he found her. Number 4. The Exorcism of Anneliese Michael. Anneliese Michael was a German woman who underwent 67 Catholic exorcism rites during the year before her death. When she was younger, she experienced a seizure and was diagnosed with psychosis caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. Shortly thereafter, she was diagnosed with depression and was treated by a psychiatric hospital. By the time she was 20, she had become intolerant of various religious objects and began to hear voices. After the taking of psychiatric medications for over 5 years failed to improve her symptoms, Anneliese and her family became convinced that she was possessed by a demon. As a result, her family appealed to the Catholic Church for an exorcism, and while rejected at first, 2 priests got permission from the local bishop in 1975. The priests began conducting exorcism sessions, and the parents stopped consulting doctors. She began increasingly speaking about dying to atone of the wayward youth of the day and the apostate priests of the modern church. Now, a total of 67 exorcism sessions, 1 or 2 each week, lasting up to hours each, were performed for approximately 10 months in 1975 and 1976. Number 3. Radium Girls. The Radium Girls were female factory workers who contracted radiation poisoning from painting radium dials, watch dials, and hands with self-luminous paint. The incidents occurred at 3 factories in the United States, one in Orange, New Jersey beginning around 1917, one in Ottawa, Illinois beginning in the early 1920s, and one in Waterbury, Connecticut also in the 1920s. Now, after being told that the paint was harmless, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip, and some also painted their fingernails, faces, and teeth with the glowing substance. Now, the prolonged exposure to radium caused dental pain, loose teeth, lesions, and ulcers, and the failure of tooth extractions to heal were some of these conditions. Now, many of the women later began to develop anemia, bone fractures, and caused their vertebrae to collapse, their jaws to swell up and fall off, and their lives to slowly end in agony while battling cancer. Now the photo here shows one of the victims, and it's truly heartbreaking. Number 2. Unit 731. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that engaged in lethal human experimentation and biological weapons manufacturing during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. Now this photo shows them experimenting on prisoners. It's estimated that this place ended the lives of 200,000 to 300,000 people. Unit 731 was responsible for some of the most notorious war crimes committed by the Japanese armed forces. It routinely conducted tests on people who were dehumanized and internally referred to as logs. Experiments included disease injections, controlled dehydration, biological weapons testing, vivisection, organ harvesting, amputation, and standard weapons testing. In other tests, subjects were deprived of food and water to determine the amount of time until death. They were also placed into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets, experimented upon to determine the relationship between temperatures, burns. They were hung upside down until death, crushed with heavy objects, electrocuted, dehydrated with hot fans, injected with animal blood, exposed to lethal doses of X-rays, subjected to various chemical weapons inside gas chambers, injected with seawater, and burned or buried alive. Now this place was truly horrific, and so many people suffered. And coming in at number 1 is Blanche Monnier. When French authorities received an anonymous tip in 1901 that a woman was being held prisoner at an aristocrat's house in the city of Poitiers, they sent out officers to search the home. Behind the locked door of the pitch-black attic, they found a skeletal middle-aged woman laying on a straw mattress covered with her own excrement, while insects and rotting food littered the floor. Now the room's odor was so disgusting that officers couldn't even continue their investigation, but they were able to learn that the 55-pound woman still clinging to life after 25 years trapped in that same room was named Blanche Monnier, and that her captor was her own mother. Now this photo of her was taken shortly after she was rescued.
Kicking off the list at number 10, William Thomas Stead. Born in 1849, William Thomas Stead was the son of Congregationalist minister, and at the age of 22, he was appointed as editor of the Northern Echo, a regional newspaper in Darlington. This British medium, Richard Borsonov, featured a photo of W.T. Stead and a spirit. Or a demon, one of the two, both pretty terrifying. While William was investigating a spiritual case, he took this photo with what's supposed to be the spirit of Pete Botha. Now, the reason many believe that maybe the spirit is evil is that Stead later on died in the Titanic. He boarded the ship to take part in a peace congress at Carnegie Hall, and survivors mentioned William Thomas Stead a few times. Apparently at dinner, he was chatting his way throughout the entire 11-course meal, recounting exciting, spooky times in his life, even mentioning a cursed mummy that he encountered at the British Museum once. That's a little odd for table talk. He even gave his life jacket to another passenger that night too. Stead would often claim that he would one day pass due to hanging or to drowning. And right before he was to be awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, he passed away due to the latter. Was he cursed? I believe so, to be honest with you. What do you guys think? Number 9, the demonic boy photograph. It doesn't matter where or when, but odds are you've probably seen this photo at some point. All those late nights when you're scrolling through Reddit, you've probably seen this at some point. I know I have, and every time I see it, I'm kind of like, it looks pretty real. It's pretty haunting. You know when you see a photo, sometimes you get bad vibes, like it registers in your brain as something scary and real. Like you want to find something that looks fake about the photo, but it's tough. This photo was taken inside the Amityville house in 1976. It appears to be a young boy or ghost, spirit, demon, whatever, with glowing white eyes. It was taken with automatic cameras equipped with infrared. And it makes it even creepier that the boy looks like he's peeking around the corner. Like he knew something was coming almost, he didn't want to get caught. That's the creepiest part here. A photographer named Gene Campbell took it, and Gene was working with paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren at the time. Yeah, the famous duo now rocking the big screen Conjuring universe. This was a real thing. They were on this case in real life. This photo was revealed 3 years after it was taken, and it was revealed on the Merv Griffin show. Imagine seeing this on a show, like Jimmy Kimmel whips this out. It's like, hey, we're gonna play Plinko. Check out this demon. Many believe this is the ghost of John DeFeo, one of the boys who lived there prior during the 1974 event. Now we're still trying to cover this one, but what do you guys think? Is this an elaborate hoax? Is this a young boy? Or is this one of the many demons that was said to haunt the house? Sound off down below. Number 8, the SS Watertown. This picture here perhaps is one of the creepiest on this list. I'm not sure what to think of this one. It comes from 1924 and it shows what appears to be two older men, or two older figures almost. I don't know, it's water, it's hard to tell. Some believe it's James Courtney and Michael Meehan in the water. Now the two had previously died and were buried at sea, hence that's why their first thought was them as to who it was. Other crew members saw these strange faces in the water as well, so when they turned back to get another look, 5 out of the 6 photos showed nothing. This was the only photo that showed what they saw. Are these the two lost crewmen, or is the vessel haunted by sinister forces? Number 7, backseat driver. This photo is from 1959. Okay, it was taken by a lady named Mabel Chinnery. And the photo at first glance is just a classic 60s shot of a man in a car. That man was Mabel's husband. Now the man in the back seat, however, that back left seat, we have no idea who that was. Her husband apparently was the only guy in the car at the time. And also, that's a pretty tough angle. If you wanted to recreate this photo with your friends after work, like try this. This is a really hard shot, even with phones now. It would be hard back in the day. It's like he's appearing to us through the seat almost with that angle. So either this is a lie, which happens often, people can lie, and a man was sitting in the back left seat, or like Mabel thinks, maybe this is her dead mother-in-law. Now, if she had said father-in-law, I think maybe it was his spirit, but this for sure looks like an older gentleman with a collar or something. Kind of looks like, dare I say it, the devil. I don't know, I read a lot of comic books.
Alright, this is a pretty famous photograph in the world of paranormal photography, and for good reason. This picture has a pretty chilling tale behind it. It's a very classic kind of ghost story. Back in 1924, during a routine voyage, tragedy struck the SS Watertown when 2 crew members, James Courtney and Michael Meehan, lost their lives and were buried at sea. 2 men had been sent to the ship's interior cofferdam to clean and do repairs, but they were unaware there was poisonous gas leaking into the area they were working in, and they died inhaling the fumes. What followed was this series of events that would go down in maritime history as one of the eeriest tales ever told by seafarers. After the burial, the remaining crew reported an unsettling sight. They claimed to see ghostly faces appearing in the water alongside the ship, and the faces looked just like Courtney and Meehan. One crew member managed to snap the famous photo that is now infamous, seemingly revealing their ghostly faces in the water. Alright, want to see part of the underground hideout of a Russian doomsday cult? Well, you're looking at it. This is one of those images you can kind of smell just by looking at. Never a good thing. Pyotr Kuznetsov led a strange group called the True Russian Orthodox Church, and in 2007 he convinced his followers to barricade themselves inside a cave. Kuznetsov wasn't with them because police had him in custody. He claimed to be a prophet, combining Christian teachings with visions of the world ending. So why did they hide in a cave? Well, they genuinely thought the world was about to end, and by shutting themselves away, they believed they could shield themselves from the apocalypse. The police found out where the cave was, but the people inside threatened to harm themselves if the police tried to step in, and after a few months, yes, months, spent in that cave, the Russian security forces finally stepped in. 2 members had actually already died in the cave and were creating dangerous fumes for the folks that were still alive. Awful. Eventually, though, they were hauled out of there. Does this look like a place you'd want to spend the night in? Probably not. It's run down, clearly abandoned. It'd probably be squatters, and there's no furniture. But even worse than all of that, this is said to be one of the most haunted places in Italy. In the quiet village of Cona stands an abandoned house known as Villa Magnoni, left vacant and untouched now for many years. Its windows, aside from one, are completely sealed up. Back in the late 80s, a group of curious young men decided to venture into this abandoned mansion. They actually managed to break in, but once inside, they heard something. It was the distant sound of children singing. At least that's what it sounded like, and it was seemingly coming from the garden. They went outside to investigate, but when they got there, it was completely empty. As they were looking around, an old woman suddenly appeared in the window above them in the house. She scolded and insulted them, demanding they leave the premises immediately. The teenagers did the smart thing and hastily booked it out of there, but just after they'd hopped into their car and began peeling off, they got into an accident. 3 of them ended up losing their lives in the crash, leaving only one survivor. In the aftermath, the villagers took the precautions and sealed off all the windows of Villa Magnoni, believing someone or something dark was lingering inside the property. Weeks later, they discovered that the covering on one specific window, the very one where the old woman had appeared to scold and curse the boys, was mysteriously uncovered. This is one of the last photos taken of the Apollo 1 crew on the day a deadly fire erupted during a pre-launch test. All 3 astronauts lost their lives. On January 27th of 1967, during a pre-launch test for the Apollo program, the crew of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee, were conducting a test at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The spacecraft was mounted on its launch vehicle. The purpose of the test was to check the spacecraft's systems and conditions, simulating a launch with external power sources disconnected. During the test, though, the crew encountered an issue. A fire broke out in the pure oxygen environment of the command module's cabin. The fire spread incredibly fast because of the highly flammable materials that were used at the time to construct the spacecraft. This is one of the last known photographs taken of a man named Michael Rockefeller, the son of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who never returned home from an expedition to Dutch New Guinea, now part of Indonesia, in 1961. Michael was on a mission to study the Asmat people, an indigenous tribe known for their unique art and customs, and while on an art collecting expedition along the coast, Michael's boat capsized. He and a fellow explorer, Rene Wassing, tried to swim to the shore, which was about 12 miles away, but Wassing eventually became too exhausted, and Michael decided he was going to continue swimming alone, hoping to reach help. But Michael would never be seen again. Now, the famous theory is that the very tribe seen with him in this photograph ate him. Now, although cannibalism was still a bit of a thing in some areas of Asmat at the time, there's not a whole lot of evidence for that. It just makes for a sensational kind of story. There's another possibility that he was attacked by sharks or just succumbed to exhaustion. This is a photograph taken inside Waverly Hills Sanitarium in Kentucky, a hospital that became famous for treating patients suffering from tuberculosis. So yeah, a lot of people died there. It opened in 1910 to treat people with the deadly lung disease. Back then, there wasn't a cure for tuberculosis, so the sanitarium focused on providing fresh air and sunlight, thinking it might help patients get better. As the years went by, better treatments for tuberculosis came along, and the need for places like Waverly Hills decreased. The sanitarium eventually closed in 1961. After that, it went through various uses. It was an old folks' home for a short time. Nothing really stuck, though. Now, what makes Waverly Hills famous, or maybe infamous, is its reputation for being very haunted. Over the years, people started to tell stories about strange things happening there. Glowing orbs, the sounds of disembodied coughs, footsteps making their way down the empty halls. One of the most famous stories is about a ghostly figure named Timmy. According to the tale, Timmy was a little boy who stayed at Waverly Hills and died there. People claim to have heard a child's laughter and seen a shadowy figure resembling a young boy. Because of all these stories, Waverly Hills has become pretty popular for ghost hunters. There have even been TV shows and documentaries filmed there. And finally, we have Mayenga Nasaka. Mayenga Nasaka was a nurse in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, during a scary time in 1976, the Ebola outbreak. This photo captures one of the last moments of her life. Mayenga got infected with the Ebola virus while she was working at Mambalat Hospital in Kinshasa. She was caring for a nun who'd been brought in from Yambuku Mission Hospital where the outbreak started. The thing is, Mayenga's case became kind of famous because she was one of the first healthcare workers to get sick during the outbreak. In the picture, you can see her standing next to another nurse taking care of a patient, but here's the heartbreaking part. Just a few days after this photo was taken, Mayenga passed away. Hospital staff didn't have the right gear to protect themselves, and there weren't enough precautions to stop them from coming into contact with patients' blood or fluids. This was the very early stages of the outbreak, and people didn't know how dangerous the virus really was at the time.
First on the list, we have Siegfried Fischbacher. Born in Bavaria, Germany on June 13th, 1939, and Roy Horn, born in Oldenburg, Germany on October 3rd, 1944. However, the pair were more commonly known as simply Siegfried and Roy. If you haven't heard of them, or if you have and you just can't quite place where the name comes from, the dynamic duo are most well known for their time spent headlining the stages of Vegas, presenting their magic act to huge crowds of adoring fans. That is, of course, until the day this photo was taken, on October 3rd of 2003. In an effort to push themselves and their act to the next level, the pair had decided to bring in a third. No, not a third person, but a 400-pound, 7-foot-long Siberian tiger, affectionately referred to as Manticore. Well, actually, Roy had adopted the tiger as a cub, but by the time the incident occurred, it was massive. On the night of October 3rd in 2003, the trio was ready to go and began their performance under the bright lights of the big city. But unfortunately, the performance was cut short, as just minutes after this picture was taken, Manticore began to stray away from his performance, seemingly interested in the person sitting in the front row of the show. Roy placed himself between the giant animal and the crowd, commanding the tiger to turn around and go back to the act, but instead the animal refused. An altercation began, during which the tiger clamped its jaws forcefully around Roy's neck and dragged him 30 feet off stage as the crowd watched in horror. Eventually, they were able to remove the animal, and Roy did later recover from his injuries, but unfortunately the show did not. Roy maintained that the tiger did not attack him, but instead that the performer had suffered a stroke and that the animal's only intention was to bring him to safety. Next, we have the final moments of Carl Williams, depicted in a CCTV screen grab moments before his death. Williams, born October 13th of 1970, was a convicted killer and an illicit substance distributor from Melbourne, Australia. He had one wife, one child, and a brother. In 2007, Carl Williams was convicted of 3 killings as well as the illicit trafficking, and was later sentenced to serve 2 consecutive life sentences for his crimes in Barwon Prison in Victoria, Australia, with a 35-year period in which he would not be eligible for parole. His sentence was, however, cut short, as on April 19th of 2010, as Williams started reading the paper, he met the beginning of his end. It seems a fellow inmate by the name of Matthew Charles Johnson, seen in the photograph approaching from behind, holding the stem of an exercise bike, had discovered that Williams had been snitching to the officers, and he was not happy. With the same exercise bike stem, he beat Williams, who died of his injuries.
Number 6. Coventry Society Demon. You may be thinking, some of these may not be demons, Taylor, maybe they're just nice spirits who stuck around after they passed. Yeah, while it's nice to believe that, photos like this convinced me otherwise. This is from the Coventry Freeman Society, and it shows everybody at this event dressed to the nines. But when you look at the top left corner over here, you see a hooded figure. Somebody that clearly doesn't belong with the vibe in this room at this event. Nobody else was seen also at any point at that night wearing a hood like this, so of course many believe it was a dark part of the afterlife photobombing this event. Honestly, I totally believe that. This is a weird one. The hood, maybe I've been watching Harry Potter lately, I don't know. Maybe it's a Dementor, we actually don't know. Number 5. The ghost pilot. Oh, this one gives me the creeps. I'm hoping it's just a friendly ghost. I included it because it's kind of nice, but you never really know, honestly. This one, I did some research, it's creepy. Any sort of spirit I don't welcome. Yeah, I don't gamble on the afterlife. I'm actually all set. The ghost pilot is a photograph that shows a spirit from 1987. A woman named Mrs. Sayer was visiting an airfield in England, so of course she did the classic tourist thing and got a photo in the cockpit. We all do it at some point, but do you ever think of who may have died in that exact spot before? After the age of 10 years old, I was like, you know what, I understand ghosts, I'm not gonna sit in that tank. I'm good, thanks. People swear the Titanic was a cursed ship and that spirits were responsible for the ship's bad luck. Now, next time you wanna sit in the pilot's seat, look around for spirits, because this image was developed and it appears that somebody or something was in the helicopter with Miss Sayer the whole time. Number 4, the Paris Demon. Originally, the tunnels under Paris were built for stone mines, but near the end of the 18th century, it turned into something haunting. Cemeteries were starting to fill up, and I mean that in a literal sense, and humans didn't figure out how to be clean, so bodies would just be laying on the sides of the roads. They started to pile up over time, so the solution was to use these catacombs. They were no longer needed for those mines anymore, so might as well use them as a mass graveyard. And now we have the scariest basement in the world. We have walls of skulls that, on one hand, it's cool as hell, it's natural history, it's gothic yet beautiful, but when Google Maps tried to give a user an up-close look, it seemed to have caught a shadowy demon figure. With more than 6 million souls laying down there, it doesn't shock me to hear about something like this at all. There's a video of the street view, and in it you can see this figure. Check it out yourself. Number 3, demons are us. For this next one, we'll be going down the Lego aisle. Yeah, how fun. A haunted Toys R Us. Can you imagine all those toys starting up at night by themselves? Bay Area's haunted Toys R Us is no longer a thing. Thankfully, as of 2018, that location closed down, but its tales, they live on forever. The Sunnyvale Toys R Us demonic presence appeared in the background of this photo. But of course, like others on this list, the people present at the time of the photo swear that nobody else was there. It's like everyone has bad memory, everyone has good memory. I can't really tell right now. It's like, could this be a spirit or a demon caught on tape that just happens to be at a Toys R Us? I vote yes. Employees talked about creepy things happening there at night all the time, and the Sunnyvale store is indeed haunted by more than one ghost. That's what people say. The store stood where the Murphy farm once stood, so many think the spirit is the ghost of Johnny Johnson. I don't know, the fact that Ouija boards are a toy that is commonly used to, I don't know, communicate with spirits, maybe closing these doors was the best call. I don't think we welcomed in any good spirits. I don't think any spirits are clocking in for work, you know what I mean? Now it's closed, so I'm like, it didn't work. Whatever we tried, didn't work. Number 2, ghost boots. These boots are made for haunting, and that's just what they'll do. Yeah, I put a pair of boots on this list. That's where we're at now. This photo of a young girl may look like a classic family trip, but upon closer inspection, it seems like somebody or something is standing behind her. Now, of course, her father said that nobody was behind her at the time that it was taken, and I agree that, and like honestly, and I believe him. Honestly, that would be pretty weird if he was like, hey, can you stand right here? Yeah, you behind my daughter, don't move, but you stand right here in this open field, thanks. Ka-ching. I don't believe it, I don't buy it, it's weird. This shot was taken at Zushi Zenagawa, Japan, and you can see boots and what looks like clothing sticking out from behind the child's elbow. The kid's father said, I took a few photos, and when I was looking through them at night, I noticed the boots behind her. I took several photos in the same spot, but only one of them had boots. You always see that in movies, right? At night they're going through and they see like it's 2 a.m. It's never at a Walmart while it's being developed. They don't find these photos in a bright, busy area. It's always in a dark kitchen. Ugh, it's creepy. So he freaked out and then put it on Reddit, and then now we're here. Full circle. And finally coming in at number 1, cave drawings. I know these aren't photos, but come on, there's nothing more eerie than humanity's origin, right? Let's do it, let's go back, let's turn the clocks back. And for archaeologists from around the world, this cave system in France doubles as the world's oldest art gallery. These Paleolithic paintings are haunting to look at. They were created from humans about 20,000 years ago, and it's now considered a heritage site. There's many of these caves around the world. So if you're thinking about sneaking down there in the Lascaux caves and taking a look yourself, well, you better think again. The cave was opened originally in 1948, but due to carbon dioxide levels from visitors, it was closed in 1963. Learning about our history is challenging, and when it's slowly fading away, that surely doesn't help. Just gotta hold your breath while you read. This is crazy. I'm currently reading a book called Supernatural by Graham Hancock, and in it he tries to dig through history to find the origins of spirituality, and markings in caves like these ones from ages ago definitely help. They resemble these demon-looking creatures almost, and this is long before religion. These drawings were supposedly from hallucinations, but many believe it's one of the first accounts of a demon interacting with a human. It's just drawn on a cave wall. Pec Merle is a cave in France that also has these strange drawings, and some say they resemble aliens, others of course voting demons.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the reenactment. This photo is extremely unsettling and for a very good reason. If, when you look at this photo, your instincts tell you that the guy in them is creepy, ding ding ding, you're right. This is a photo that features the German serial killer Joachim Kroll. He is known for taking the lives of 14 people, all varying in age, and he is known for also consuming parts of their flesh. This monster was caught in 1976, and he was discovered when police found out that he had clogged the plumbing in his apartment with remains of one of his victims. How gruesome is that? This photo was taken shortly after he was caught and arrested, and what you're seeing is Kroll reenacting one of his crimes for the police. I get goosebumps just thinking about that. I couldn't imagine being there or being the police officer he's on top of. Talk about terrifying. I'm just glad that they caught him and got him off of the street. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Pioneer's Defense. This photo is known as the Pioneer's Defense, and man, does it ever look creepy. This photo comes from 1937, and it was taken by a Russian photographer named Viktor Bulla. This photo takes place in the Leningrad area, which is now known as St. Petersburg, which is the second largest city in Russia. The people in this photo were part of a group that was the 1930s Russian equivalent of our Boy Scouts that was called the Young Pioneers. The masks on their faces leaves a very eerie feeling, and for a fair reason. These people were doing a military preparation drill, which is the reason for the gas masks. This photo was taken during a time when the country was under the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, and the residents were constantly unsure of what was going to happen. The country was already seeing death, and people were already frightened, happened just a few years before the start of World War II, and those in this photo felt the need to be prepared for the worst case scenario. In our number 8 spot today, we have the net test. This photo comes to us from 1958, and it is quite an interesting one. At a first glance, it looks fun, but then when you catch the expression on the person's face and look a little more into it, it really just leaves you with a ton of questions as to what exactly is going on here. It looks like a guy is going on some sort of a roller coaster ride, but what is actually happening is that a prisoner is being used to test safety nets before they were mass produced. Yeah, not the good time we thought it was. This comes from a time where capital punishment was much more widespread throughout the United States, and those waiting on death row couldn't just sit around waiting for their day to come. I think it's probably best that we made the switch to crash test dummies and that sort of thing, and this photo just remains as an eerie reminder of the less than great choices that were made in the past. In our number 7 spot today, we have a burst of joy. You might be looking at this photo wondering how this extremely joyous photo could hold any dark secrets. Well, this photo won a Pulitzer Prize, and for a good reason. This photo was captured by Slava Vetter on March 17, 1973 at the Travis Air Force Base in California. This photo shows United States Air Force Lieutenant Robert L. Sturm and his family. This was taken as he was being reunited with his family after 5 years of being held as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. On October 27, 1967, he was leading a flight of F-105s when he was shot down over Hanoi and held captive until March 14, 1973. I can't imagine what this must have been like for his family, because there was a huge chance that he could have not come home at all. The looks on their faces, of course, clearly show that this photo is capturing an exceptionally joyful moment. It's just the story behind this moment that leaves us all with that unsettling feeling.
The last photo of Lady Diana, along with her partner Dottie Fade and driver Henry Paul, is next on the list. The former princess, born July 1st of 1961 in Norfolk, United Kingdom, lived to be just 36 years old before she met her end in a car crash on August 31st, 1997. There have been multiple theories as to what caused the crash that took the lives of Diana, Fade, and Paul, but the three most popular are probably that it was 1, an accident caused by paparazzi flash blinding the driver, causing him to crash; 2, that the driver Henry Paul had been struggling with substance abuse and lost control of the vehicle due to being under the influence; and 3, that the crash was a cover-up constructed by the royal family after the separation of Diana and former prince, now King, Charles. It has been speculated that Lady Diana was survived by a daughter she had previously hidden from the public, but this was never confirmed. Even after her death, many continue to recognize her regality, with a large amount of the British population even affectionately referring to the maiden as the People's Princess. Next, we have Jane Wicker, the Plane Dancer, also known as the ballerina in the sky. At the age of 44, Jane was at the top of the game in the extreme sport of wing-walking daredevil entertainment. On the 22nd of June in 2013, the mother of 2, along with her pilot, Charlie Schweckner, made their ascent in a small 50 HP Stearman airplane for what they believed would be nothing more than a routine act. But unfortunately, that was not the case. Things took a dark turn when the aircraft seemingly stalled in the air before plummeting and crashing on the ground, with the pilot at the wheel and Wicker on the wing. Upon impact, the plane burst into flames and the pair were killed instantly. Schwenker, the veteran pilot, had been flying for the Circus Air Show since 1990, 23 years, and Wicker was survived by her 2 sons and fiancé. Up next, at our halfway point, we have the last ever photo taken of R. Bud Dwyer. The American politician, born November 21st of 1939, served as a member of the Pennsylvania State Senate from 1971 to 1981, and as a Pennsylvania treasurer from 1981 to 1987, during which time he was charged with 5 counts of mail fraud, 4 counts of racketeering, and 4 counts of perjury conspiracy to commit bribery. Later, in 1986, the disgraced politician was found guilty and convicted of 11 counts of conspiracy, mail fraud, perjury, racketeering, and accepting bribes. Dwyer's sentencing date was scheduled for January 23rd of the following year, but as you've probably guessed, he never made it to court. On January 22nd of 1987, just 1 day before Dwyer was scheduled to receive his sentence, he called for a news conference to be held in the Pennsylvania State Capitol Capitol building, as well as for said conference to be broadcasted live across the state, which it was. Reporters jumped at the opportunity to have one final chance to question Dwyer before sentencing, but little did they know that this would be the last time anyone would ask Dwyer anything, as halfway through the broadcast, ex-treasurer reached into an envelope and pulled out a weapon and ended his life. The really sad part is that Dwyer had maintained that he was innocent throughout the entirety of his court case, and it was only after his death that it was discovered he'd been framed for the whole thing. Next up, we have a photograph depicting the final moments of two Dutch service technicians. On October 29th of 2013, the two men made their way up to the top of a turbine for some maintenance work, and when they arrived at the top, a fire broke out, blocking the only chance of escape for both Dan Kous and Aaron Cortus. The two can be seen embracing between the two blades of the giant windmill just moments before they met their separate ends. One of the men decided to leap from the structure and was later found in a field below, and the other found inside the charred remains of the turbine when firefighters were eventually able to make it up to the scene of the fire. The two men were members of an incredibly close-knit village near Amersfoort in Netherlands, and their deaths are said to have caused a profoundly deep sense of mourning within the communities. The Hindenburg is next up on the list. Commonly confused for a blimp, the long airship was actually a conventional Zeppelin design, meaning that the Hindenburg contained an internal framework to maintain its shape, while blimps rely on only internal air pressure. The airship was the pride of 1937 Germany when it was launched on May 6th of that year, carrying 36 passengers and 61 crewmen. However, the joyous moment was short-lived, as not long after its ascent, the airship exploded, most likely due to a gas leak that caused hydrogen from the vessel to mix with the oxygen in the air, and a small spark created by nothing more than static electricity caused the Hindenburg to be engulfed in flames. Surprisingly, the accident only caused 36 fatalities compared to the 92 people on board, and considering the entire aircraft had been engulfed in flames. Of the deceased from the incident were 13 passengers, 22 crewmen aboard the ship, and 1 ground crew member. Starting off our top 3, we have a photograph of Lalisa de Sisa, the first across the finish line of the Boston Marathon on April 15th of 2013, winning him the gold medal. Just 2 hours later, explosions went off in the very spot where the photograph had been captured, taking the lives of 3 people and badly injuring another 300. A year later, in 2014, Lalisa decided to return his gold medal to the city. He had also privately given his racing bib to a woman who had lost her lower leg and her husband, who had also sustained serious injuries from the incident. The year following the attack, de Sisa returned to compete again in the Boston Marathon, saying that sports hold the power to unify and connect people all over the world, and that they should never be used as a battleground. He also wanted to show that he was not scared, and he did just that, as in his 2015 do-over, he won for a second time, finishing even faster than he did the previous year. Next up, we have an aerial view shot looking down on Hiroshima and its people just moments before the 5-ton nuclear weapon, nicknamed Little Boy, dropped from the Enola Gray airliner onto the town and its civilians, releasing an explosive force equal to 20,000 tons of TNT, causing mass catastrophic destruction and the instant deaths of an estimated 80,000 people, and the prolonged deaths of thousands more due to radiation poisoning. It has also been estimated that 90% of the city was wiped out that day, the 6th of August in 1994. And the attack was followed up just 3 days later when another atomic bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, releasing a similar explosive force, this one being equal to the force of 21,000 tons of TNT. And coming in at number 1, we have a photograph of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sofia Chotek, taken June 28th in 1914 of Sarajevo, Bosnia. Just moments after this photo was taken, the Archduke was assassinated directly in front of his wife by 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip. Although the Archduke, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was not the most popular royal at the time, what happened following his death was unprecedented global warfare, the war to end all wars, which would later come to be known as World War I. War was officially declared on July 28th of 1914 and lasted for 4 years, coming to an end on November 11th in 1918. But even after the Great War, as it has been referred to, was finished, the repercussions sent shockwaves throughout nations that extended into the Second, even more devastating World War II.
Number 10. The Nuclear Shadows of Hiroshima. With Oppenheimer out in theaters, why not start off this list about the bombing of Hiroshima? For those of you who don't know, on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the United States detonated 2 atomic bombs over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively. The aerial bombings together killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people, most of whom were civilians, and remain the only use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. Now, for all the people who lost their lives, only a nuclear shadow remained. When the bomb detonated at 1,900 feet above the city center of Hiroshima, the subsequent explosion caused temperatures of 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit to annihilate nearly everything within 1,600 feet of the bomb's blast zone. Almost anything and anyone within a mile was destroyed. The bomb's light and heat were so extreme that they bleached the city's exposed surfaces, except in places where an unsuspecting person shielded the building or sidewalk or bridge from the blast with their own body in their final moments alive. It's truly disturbing that people were just enjoying their lives and it was gone in an instant, and that you can physically see that with the shadows. Number 9. Radium Girls. The Radium Girls were female factory workers who contracted radiation poisoning from painting radium dials, watch dials with hands with self-luminous paint. The incident occurred at 3 facilities in the United States, one in Orange, New Jersey beginning around 1917, one in Ottawa, Illinois beginning in the early 1920s, and one in Waterbury, Connecticut also in the 1920s. After being told that the paint was harmless, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip, and some also painted their fingernails, faces, and teeth with the glowing substance. The prolonged exposure to the radium caused dental pain, loose teeth, lesions, and ulcers, and the failure of tooth extractions to heal were some of these conditions. Many of the women later began to develop anemia, bone fractures, and caused their vertebrae to collapse and their jaws to swell up and fall off. And their lives were slowly ended in agony while battling cancer. The photo here shows one of these victims, and it's truly heartbreaking. Number 8. Crime Scene Message. Called the Lipstick Killer, William Herons liked to take the lives of women. On June 5, 1945, Josephine Ross was discovered deceased in her home. She had been pierced repeatedly with a blade and was clutching dark-colored hairs in her hands. Nearly a year later, Frances Brown was discovered deceased with a blade lodged in her neck and a bullet wound, and what they found at the crime scene was scary. Written in lipstick on the wall, a message said, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." Now, the man responsible, William Herons, was caught soon after the message was discovered and was convicted for ending the lives of several people. At the time of his death, William was reportedly Illinois' longest-serving prisoner, having spent 65 years in prison. He spent the later years of his sentence at the Dixon Correctional Center in Dixon, Illinois. Though he remained imprisoned until his death, William had recanted his confession and claimed to be the victim of coercive interrogation and police brutality. So who really knows the truth, but that message is haunting, and I can't even imagine what was going through the heads of the first responders who found it. Number 7. The Exorcism of Anneliese Michael. Anneliese Michael was a German woman who underwent 67 Catholic exorcism rites during the year before her death. When she was younger, she experienced a seizure and was diagnosed with psychosis caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. Shortly thereafter, she was diagnosed with depression and was treated by a psychiatric hospital. By the time she was 20, she'd become intolerant of various religious objects and began to hear voices. After the taking of psychiatric medications for 5 years failed to improve her symptoms, Anneliese and her family became convinced that she was possessed by a demon. As a result, her family appealed to the Catholic Church for an exorcism, and while rejected at first, 2 priests got permission from the local bishop in 1975. The priests began conducting exorcism sessions, and the parents stopped consulting doctors. A total of 67 exorcism sessions, 1 or 2 each week, lasting up to 4 hours each, were performed over approximately 10 months in 1975 and 1976. None of these worked or improved her condition, and it resulted in her dying of malnutrition at the age of 23 in 1976, weighing just 68 pounds. Now, this is a ghastly photo of her when she was possessed, and I can't imagine what that poor girl went through.
In our number 6 spot today, we have Ghost Boy. This photo is said to have been taken inside of the infamous Amityville horror house in 1976. It is said that this creepy vintage photo is still one of the most chilling paranormal photos of all time. Yep, that's right, this photo is said to be of a ghost. After the DeFeo killing, the next owner of the house, George Lutz, swore that the house was haunted, and he called in none other than Ed and Lorraine Warren, the most famous paranormal investigators ever. On one night of the investigations, they set up an automatic camera on the second floor of the house, and this photo is said to have been caught then. Some believe that the ghostly face staring back is that of a young John Defoe who lost his life in this house. I'm not 100% sure either way, but what I am sure of is that if this is actually a photo of a ghost and not a real person, that is ridiculously creepy. In our number 5 spot today, we have a UFO report. This is less of a photo and is actually more like a PDF, but I still felt like it applied to today's list. This is a previously classified document from 1963. Although the document still has a ton of information that has been blacked out, the document is the description and report of an unidentified flying object, or a UFO encounter. This is said to have taken place over the desert of Nevada, and the report was written in detail in order to have a written record of the event. This document is said to have been the authentic report from the FBI, which is exactly why some of the details have still been omitted. This might seem like less of a big deal now, as in this day and age we have declassified video footage of similar kinds of encounters, but for 1963 this was huge. As discussions of alien or extraterrestrial life is a big part of our modern day society, this document shows that these things have been on our minds for many, many years now. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Apollo 1 prayer. This photo was originally taken and meant to be a sort of lighthearted prank or joke, but it would later turn out to be a chilling image. This photo shows the Apollo 1 crew jokingly praying over a miniature model of their command module. The 3 men in the photo are Roger Chaffee, Virgil Grissom, and Ed White, and sadly during a test launch on January 27, 1967, they all burned to death. To make this story even worse, prior to the test, the 3 of them had voiced concerns about the amount of flammable material that was on the craft. The fire was determined to have been caused by an electrical fault, and it spread extremely quickly due to combustible nylon material coupled with the high-pressure pure oxygen atmosphere in the cabin. They also were unable to be rescued or escape because the plug door hatch couldn't be opened against the internal pressure of the cabin. Before this test, it was believed that since there was no fuel on the rocket, it would be relatively safe, which is exactly why there wasn't more preparedness in case of emergency. Looking back now, this photo is certainly more mysterious than anyone at the time could have ever imagined. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Hilo tsunami. This photo comes to us from April 1st, 1946. This is the day when an 8.6 magnitude earthquake hit just off of the coast of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. As we all know, earthquakes can often have after effects, and this one sent shockwaves throughout the Pacific. This led to the formation of an ocean-wide tsunami that had waves reaching up to 13 stories high. This disaster went on to strike Hilo, Hawaii, in what became one of the worst disasters in Hawaiian history. This photo somehow survived the disaster, and it captures the terrifying view someone must have had in their last moments. This photo is especially chilling to view just days after the Tonga volcano eruption occurred. The Earth and these naturally occurring disasters are absolutely terrifying and powerful and unpredictable. In our number 2 spot today, we have the shadows. As most of us know, on August 6th, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. This was devastating to the city, and of course we can understand the implications of this. This photo shows what is called a nuclear shadow, and this is just one that could be seen throughout the city. When the bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the center of the city, the explosion caused temperatures of 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit to spread through everything within 1,600 feet of it. This of course destroyed nearly everything and everyone within a mile of it. The light and heat from the bomb was so powerful that it bleached the exposed surfaces of the city, except as seen here, where an unsuspecting person was shielding the surface with their own body. It is truly such an eerie reminder of the impact that this really had. In our number 1 spot today, we have the crash. This is one of those photos that was just taken in the right place at the right time, but it shows a very scary situation. A man named Jim Meads is said to have taken this photo in 1962. Story goes that a man named Bob Sauray had mentioned to Jim that he was going to fly this plane called the Lightning the following day. Jim took his kids out for a walk that next day and took his camera with him, intending to get a shot of the aircraft as Bob flew it. He wanted to get a photo of his children with the airfield in the background, just as the plane was coming into land. They found the spot, they got all set up, just waiting for the plane to return. Turns out that day Bob didn't fly the plane, and instead the pilot was actually a man named George Aird, who was another test pilot. So George is up in the plane and he realizes that there's trouble. Since I don't know plane language, I'm gonna use this quote from fearoflanding.com, which wrote, quote, "Whilst carrying out a demonstration flight, there was a fire in the aircraft's reheat zone. Unburnt fuel in the rear fuselage had been ignited by a small crack in the jet pipe and had weakened the tailplane actuator anchorage. This weakened the tailplane control system, which failed with the aircraft at 100 feet on final approach." This led to the plane pitching up aggressively as George came into land. George lost control and he ejected in order to save himself. Luckily, since the nose had pitched up, he had just enough time. The tractor driver in this photo was then 15-year-old Mike Sutterby, who had spent that summer working on this airfield. He wasn't actually posing, he was telling Jim to move since he wasn't supposed to be there, before turning to look at what was happening behind him. This is all what led to this photo being snapped and this story surviving all of these years. In the end, George was okay, aside from some minor injuries, and while Jim didn't get the photo he set out for that day, he still got quite an interesting one.